Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think
Yeah, we can start.
Okay.
okay.
So Rupali, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to the eighth session on the South Asian Landscapes e-symposium organized by the School of Environment and Architecture. My name is Rupali Gupte. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture, which we fondly call C. But I'm also one of the co-founders of the institution. This is a session this is now the eighth session, and in thinking of South Asia, we've been arguing for the regional turn that, in some ways takes us beyond narrow nationalistic concerns and identities, and builds on our cultural continuities, our common contemporary situations, and our collective intelligence to segue us into the future. We've had a very successful symposium so far, and we've had scholars and practitioners from South Asia speaking here, from Nepal, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, and this is the Pakistan series that we're starting. We also had a talk on India by from C itself, and today we are very honored to have with us a very tall scholar and practitioner, Arif Hasan Saab here, and I'm very delighted that he has accepted to be with us. His lecture titled The Changing Nature of Informal Settlements in Pakistan, with a special reference to Karachi, will discuss the processes of settling of informal housing in the peripheries of Karachi, their physical and socio-economic repercussions, the actors and the interests involved with them, and the role of formal sector in housing, which has created massive speculation in an already skewed housing situation. I'm going to read Arif Saab's bio because it's an illustrious, long bio, as we know. Arif Hassan is an architect, planner, activist, teacher, researcher, and the author of a large number of books, research papers, and monographs on urban and rural development. He has been the principal consultant to the Orangi Pilot Project Research and Training Institute from 1981 to 2017. He's also founder chairperson of the Urban Resource Center Karachi and a founding member of the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights Bangkok. He has also taught at Pakistani and European universities, been a member and chair of various national and UN committees on policy, and his activism has led to the modification of a number of projects in favor of low-income communities. He has received a number of national and international awards for his work. And so we're very happy to have Arif Saab here with us. And with that, over to you, Arif Saab. We're really looking forward to this talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. It's very difficult to decide what to say. There are so many things that one can talk about in this very rapidly changing world, which has completely changed in my lifetime. When I began practicing and working in low-income settlements, there was no such thing as an NGO. There was no such thing as civil society. These terms came a good 10, 15 years after I started practicing. And with the emergence of these terms and the organizations that developed around them and the nature of those organizations, housing changed a lot. What I will try and do, you can do it. I'll do it. What I'll try and do is I'll try and introduce Karachi to begin with. This is the city. And it has been occupied for a very long time, mainly because of its natural harbor. But as a city, it started developing in the 18th century, in the 1830s. And at independence, it had a population of 450,000. Today, there's much discussion as to what its population is, but generally the accepted figure is 22 million. And much of this population increase has been because of migration from India, from Bangladesh, from Burma, and more than anywhere else from Afghanistan. Lot of conflict in our neighborhood, especially the west of our neighborhood, has led to migration from the north of Pakistan to the city as well. And also there have been earthquakes, floods, and droughts since 2000. And everybody wants to come to Karachi because this is where you can earn a livelihood. This massive migration created a housing demand, and of course, that housing demand was not met. So, about 50% of the households in Karachi live in informally created settlements. Now, the trends are very clear. Uh, in the case of Karachi, as a matter of fact, in the case, it's really about all of Pakistan. Migration is unprecedented in the last decade and a half. And this is because there's been a change from barter and cash and caste relations, an economy governed by these two things, to cash and to an end of local governance systems based on caste. And also, there are new cropping and marketing systems. So, Karachi's population increased from 9.8 million to about 18 to 20 million in 2011. And this is going to continue. I mean, it's not going to stop. And this has led to the densification of the settlements, in addition to the spreading out of the city. Then there's been the impact of neoliberal policies, which we have adopted without really knowing what they are, what it means, what the philosophy and thinking behind it is. And so housing has to be accessed from the market. There's an increasing housing supply gap, but it is not in percentages terms. Percentage terms, it has closed considerably, but it is there in number terms. And then you have change, socioeconomic and physical, in the old settlements. Then there has been the capture of heritage and urban spaces by elite communities through emerging land use plans and gentrification, and an increasing formal sector unemployment. But in the case of Karachi, which I will briefly touch upon this, you have another issue, which is the politics of ethnicity of a very divided city and its impact on low income housing and governance systems. If I look at the history of informal settlements in the city, after independence, we had unorganized invasions of very large invasions of people from India. Between 1951 and 58, there was bulldozing and relocation of settlements, of the unorganized invasions. We had social housing on a massive scale by setting up satellite towns in which nobody wanted to live at that time. They're occupied now. Then we decided that we could not afford this expensive housing, and we just had plot townships with no services. And people somehow the other managed to get those services for themselves. This was followed by informal subdivisions, which we call Kachiyabadis, on public land. This was done by informal developers who became very powerful in the process, and many contested elections and won. We had regularization of these settlements. 62% of Karachiites live in Kachiyabadis today, and 72% have either been regularized or marked for regularization. And today we are passing through a period of immense densification. Well, but new Kachiyabadis are not like the old ones, and they are slowly becoming history. And this is because the city was small uh, once upon a time, and there was no middle class demand. So the city periphery was near the places of work. at that time since it was small. Now the city periphery where land is available and is cheap enough for the poor to buy is very far away from work areas. Living on the periphery has very serious problems of travel time and social costs. In addition, there are no jobs there are no social amenities, and it's very difficult for women to work. Also, the immediate periphery is now being occupied by large housing projects where you have gated communities. So they are pushing the Kathiawardis even farther away from the city center and from places where work is available, where industry is available. There are the reasons also for Kathiawardis becoming history. Now, land costs have multiplied enormously, as this slide shows you. I won't go through it. Construction costs of semi permanent housing and rentals in low income settlements, their costs have increased enormously. And so people find it very difficult to build in addition to living so far away. This just shows you how the city has grown. In 41, it had a population of 450,000 and an area of about 150 square kilometers. Today, it has a population of about 20 to 22 million. Its area is 3,900 square kilometers, and its densely built up area is about 500 square kilometers. Enormous change, and so there's bound to be difficulties in managing this change. Now, if you look at this map, the area that is marked in red, circled by red, was the Karachi of 1951. The orange circles that you see were the Kathiawardis of the early period. The triangles in blue are the work areas. And you see that the work areas and the Kathiawardis were close to each other. In many cases, they were walking distance or cycling distance. But with the passage of time, they started to move away naturally from the work areas, which are shown as triangles. And you have the squares, the yellow squares, which were built in the 80s and 90s. And then in green, you have the areas that are being built now. So this increase, this enormous increase in distances has had a major effect on the low-income settlements in Karachi. And on your, that is on my right, you have two townships, elite townships that are coming up, for which special road infrastructure is being provided so that they can access the city easily. Now, the housing demand supply gap, I'll say a few words about that. Karachi demand is 120,000 units per year. Formal sector supply is 42,000. Accommodated in Kathiawardis is 32,000. And the rest is accommodated through densification of existing homes. And I'll discuss later the issues of densification. The government estimates, according to government estimates, 1.7 million households will be added to Karachi's population between 2005 and 2020. These are government figures. This means a supply of 100,000 units per year. So if you look at the figures I've given above, the formal sector supplies a fraction of this. The rest is either not supplied or it goes into the Kathiawardis. In any case, in the last 2 years, now 90,000 plots have been developed informally for low and lower middle income groups on the northern and western fringe of Karachi. And most of these are lying empty. People don't want to live there because it's expensive. Travel costs, time, jobs, etc. Now, it is not possible with current government policies to access formal housing. So the demand and Kachi Abadis will continue to grow or they will continue to densify. We have serious problems in estimating demand supply gap because the census results for Karachi have been withheld because of great controversy. There are claims that Karachi's population has been underestimated by 70 lakhs. So this debate is ongoing. It is continuing even now when the local body elections are supposed to take place. These are some figures I gathered some time ago as to densities. If I take Karachi, the actual density in 2011 was 2,280, and the maximum permissible density was 1,625. The reason for this difference is clear here. On one hand, you have informal settlements, and the other hand, you have formal settlements. So you can see how big the difference and the difference in density is. You can see that again over here. Now, there are big inequities in land supply and housing. About 62% of Karachi's citizens live in informal settlements, and densities in these settlements are between 1,500 to 4,500 persons per hectare, and they continue to increase. Persons per room is 6 to 10, and there is a major issue of toilets. Uh, Settlements that we have surveyed, you have one toilet, in certain cases, one toilet for up to 20, 25 persons. And the House Building Finance Corporation in Pakistan started a toilet loan. It was perhaps the most popular loan that they issued. The loan was issued to the most popular. And they had wonderful ads for that. In one ad, I speak in Urdu, in one ad, there was a man shouting, "Bahar aao, bahar aao, come out, come out. Mujhe kaam pe jana hai, to go to work, I'm in a hurry, I'm in a hurry." And she says from inside, "I am a human being also, I have needs." And then the house building finance representative's voice comes, "Don't fight. Take a toilet loan from the House Building Finance Corporation." So it was very popular. And that's a very serious issue, the issue of toilets. Unfortunately, it's an increasing issue. Now, 36% of Karachiites live in planned settlements. And they are nearer to formally planned settlements on residential lands. And there the densities can be as low as 80 persons per hectare, and they continue to decrease in the new settlements. The other factor that impinges in a big way on informal housing, Kachi Abadis, is that Karachi, regarding land, is that Karachi has over 250,000 vacant developed plots, formally developed, and over 68,000 empty apartments. In spite of this, an added 600,000 are being developed or constructed by the formal sector. Now, none of this new development is for low-income groups or even for higher income groups. It's almost entirely for speculation. And there is a very serious debate as far as the people are concerned, not as far as the government is concerned, on whether they want apartments or they don't want houses. Let me come now to how people house themselves today. Post-liberalization, the de facto government policy is you access the market. To make that possible, they have liberalized credit terms in a big way. There's no doubt of that. However, collateral is required, and the poor do not have it. They can, however, if they manage to get a lease for a regularized Kachi Abadi, if they manage to get a lease, they can apply for a loan and use their collateral, use their house as a collateral. But that is only for improving uh, the house or pulling it down and reconstructing it. There is no credit for the purchase of land, and the developers do not cater to this issue at all. Now, you also require formal sector jobs for getting a loan. That's also a condition if you don't have collateral. But 72% of Karachiites work informally. So, what is the market response? The market response is the densification of existing kachi abadis. By changing one or two story houses informally into flats, changing them into high rise buildings. And this is done in three ways. One, house owners, they build upwards to accommodate the expanding family or relatives who are coming from the villages. The other is that house owners build upwards to create rentals for additional income. And there is a big demand for this since people don't wish to live on the periphery. Then you have informal developers purchasing land from the house owners and paying them in cash plus two apartments on the top floor. So the informal developer comes to you and says, here you are, here is 4 lakh rupees. And the person has never seen 4 lakh rupees altogether ever in his life. And I give you this and I'll give you 2 flats on the top floor. So the deal is struck. The developer builds the house and the person's family starts living on the floors above. This has slowly becoming the most popular way of densification, and a large number of informal developers have emerged as a result all over Karachi. The changing these settlements into semi-high-rise buildings is strictly illegal, but through arrangements with the informal arrangements with the bureaucracy and the Sindh Building Control authorities and the cantonment boards, this is fairly well managed. So these were the abadis in which I started working in the 70s and 80s. These were their houses. Children could play, there was enough space in them. Women could do business on the threshold of their homes. And these are the same settlements today. They are going up. And with the passage of time, the developers are becoming more and more sophisticated. And the houses are not cheap, but people beg, borrow, and manage to raise the money for these houses, to purchase these houses. Or they pay what is known as pagdi or goodwill, and then the rents come down substantially. And usually, from the case studies that we have done, the people borrow mostly from their employers. So there's really no estimate of how many houses of this sort have emerged, but it is well over 200,000 from some estimates that have been prepared. So these are the new settlements, completely different from the old ones. Life also in these settlements is very different from the old settlements, which I will try and explain. Now, with the passage of time, these informal developer-built homes, they are becoming smaller and smaller to make them affordable. 6 to 10 persons per room average in some settlements which we have surveyed. There are no lifts for women with children and old persons. Once you've climbed 4, 5 stories, 6 stories, there's no way that you can come down. We met old couples who hadn't come down for 7, 8 months and then had to be carried up later on. There are no rules and regulations that are followed in this construction. A common complaint was that we are so many people living in such small rooms that there is freedom to stay away from the home for the menfolk and from because the house is just too packed. So they go and sleep on the street below, or they go and sleep in the park or open spaces that are available in most of the areas. And also, there is greater freedom for women also to stay away from home, off and on. Women complain of the formation of gangs because they can no longer supervise their children. Before they used to play before their eyes, so supervision was possible. But now they cannot because the lane contains a lot of people whom they don't know. It contains shops, it contains people from outside. So the neighborhood feeling has yet to be developed. And in some cases where this development took place very early on, that has developed. The issue of toilets I have already mentioned. Then the growth of rentals, but they are very vulnerable because no rent laws apply in this case. Whoever has strength, the landlord has the strength, he has his goons, he can have people thrown out as his will. One thing that my colleague Mansoor Rara has pointed out again and again, that political control by certain political parties has become easier in these high-rise buildings than it was when you had uh, 1 or 2 story houses rather than flats. The seriousness of this change can also be judged by the fact that there has been an increase in household size by 10% between 1998 and 2011, though the fertility rates have actually dropped. I'll let this go. It just shows how separate kitchens, separate latrines, separate bathrooms have actually decreased rather than increased over a period in between 1981 and 1998. To understand the issues related to these changes, we made a study of four uh, housing uh, not projects, but for settlements, for Kachi Abadis and 1 and 2 settlements, planned settlements. And we see how the number of persons per apartment or per settlement has increased. Labour Square is a formal developer built housing scheme. In 1976, number of persons per apartment was 5.8, and in 2010, when we looked at it, it was 10. A informal settlement, a Kachi Abadi, in 73, called Nava Lane, was 450 persons per hectare. In 2010, its density has increased to 3,500 persons per hectare. Similarly, Paposh Nagar, formal sector to begin with, but abandoned by the Karachi Municipal Council Committee. Uh, it's a lower middle income settlement. In 1955, its density was 250, and in 2010, it was 1,180. So this massive densification has taken place all over the city, wherever there were not only Kachi Abadis, but also in cases where there was planned areas. What sort of a city we will have if this continues is a subject we can discuss at the end. Now, people invariably prefer houses to apartments, and very often they even sell their apartments to go and buy houses. Governments, meanwhile, wish to bulldoze the settlements and build medium rise apartment blocks by providing land to the developers. Government reasoning is that in apartments you can get higher densities and that they give the city what the documents call a modern look. Our work shows that the individual house option can provide higher densities than permitted by the Karachi building laws and zoning regulations. Some examples of remodeling of existing Kachi Abadis and getting the same densities as they currently have. But these plans have not been really accepted. Appreciated, yes, but there's a big difference between appreciation and acceptance. So this is the one aspect of the housing situation. The other aspect that in which change is taking place is the changing nature of migration. Earlier migrations came from settled societies to welcoming cities. But now migration is coming from areas where the old community governance systems have no moral authority left and where cash has replaced barter. The old Kachi Abadis have consolidated physically and socially. New Kachi Abadis are increasingly catering to circulating populations. The changing patterns for older settlements I have already explained to you. Their settlement, how the settlements have changed, but also their voting patterns have changed. And the changes that I'll discuss this change further because I think it's important as to how the voting patterns have changed. And the major change that has taken place is that previously the Kachi Abadis invariably voted for those parties who promised regularization and always participated in pro-poor causes. But now they increasingly have voted in the recent past for centrist parties, religious parties, and also for parties of an ethnic nature. And these older settlements do not support pro-poor causes like they used to before. Now, migrants, after two generations, we have noticed, begin to change and loosen their links with the rural areas. And they change physically, they change in their aspirations, they change socially. And the biggest change that we have noticed is in the age group of 15 to 24. Changes in marriage structures, in family structures, the rapid phasing out of the extended family. We'll discuss this also with figures later on. Also, they bother less about water, electricity, etc. They do bother about it. But in addition, the importance of schools has increased considerably. The importance of cultural events and culture has increased enormously. And they want jobs whereby they can earn more. They are rapidly have a rapidly upward mobility culture, which in the past 10 years or so they have not been able to fulfill. Now, I've already mentioned this. They voted for progressive parties, regularization of their settlements. Now they vote for the more conservative parties. Also, their relationship with officialdom has changed from protest to negotiations. And what is very important is that they constitute the largest group of voters in Karachi. I will skip over this. This is more in detail. So the old settlements, you can see they have beauty parlors in them. They have schools with Mickey Mouse, private schools teaching English, which is extremely important to these old settlements. Computer centers, training centers, cyber cafes. Now I'll just go into some of the social change aspects. In the age group of 15 and 24, in 1981, 13.3%, 4%, let's say 13.4% of men were married. In 2006, 7 were married, 7%. Women, 38.9, about, let's say, 39% were married. 2006, 19 were married. Literary percentage for men was 66%, for women was 62%. For both of them now, it is 83%. Nuclear family formation, it was 57 in 1987, and in 2006, it was 84.5%. So this is a huge, very huge difference. Court marriages, this is really where a couple goes to court and seeks the protection of the court from violence by the family if it's a love marriage, a self-will marriage. Data shows an increase in geometric progression. I have never been able to get the correct figures, but the most reliable ones that I think probably the most reliable, that in 1992, there were 12 to 15 cases per day for court marriages in Karachi. And that when we tried to find this out, which was in 2006, there were more than 250 cases per day. Women dominate the universities. Karachi University 68%, medical students 87%, engineering university 50%, architecture and planning 92%. Now, because of these, there's major changes in gender relations, in the use of public space in certain areas, and there is a major conflict between tradition and social reality. Can I just see the time? I should finish. There has been a major impact of the world-class city vision and liberalization. It is the same as has happened everywhere else. I don't have to go into details about this. This has led to the building of what is known as investment-friendly infrastructure, which is flyovers, signal-free roads, causing extreme inconvenience to pedestrians. The direct foreign investment sort of issue. And there's housing to be delivered by the market, the emergence of a powerful class of developers. And looking at all this, we at the Urban Resource Center accepted that, okay, this is how it's going to be. It's going to be projects. So we put down these 4 points. Projects should not be for judging projects, that projects should not damage the ecology of the region in which Karachi is located. Projects must determine land use on the basis of social and environmental considerations and not on the basis of land value alone. We made a matrix to show exactly what the importance of land would be in different circumstances. The third thing was that projects should serve the interests of the majority, which are low and low middle income groups. And since we are a very diverse society and city, we said that projects should respect and enhance the tangible and intangible culture of the communities that live in Karachi. In a presentation that I made, in which I put forward these 4 points, I was told that Mr. Hasan, with these 4 points, there won't be any projects. But I think that this slowly is being understood by the planners of our city. A lot of acts have been framed which support the developers at the cost of the city and at the cost of the poorer sections of the population. Huge projects are being developed, whereas enormous areas lie empty. Much of this development is on the city fringe, causing enormous ecological damage and also damage to historic sites. As far as ecology is concerned, a lot of encroachment on the outfalls to the city by elite projects. There's been reclamation from mangroves, again, which is illegal by law, but it's carried on. And that reclamation takes place by dumping uh, solid waste of the city into the mangrove marshes. The city expansion over the last 12 years has evicted 2,800 plus villages, impoverishing the rural population. And just to show how big this damage is, 70% of Karachi's vegetable and fruit requirements were met by its rural areas in 1985. In 2013, this was reduced to 10%. And another major damage was that at an estimate, 60 billion cubic feet of sand and gravel has been illegally lifted for construction from the seasonal rivers, making recharging of the aquifer impossible and depleting the rainwater aquifer. Huge business, the sand and gravel business.
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt you, sir.
Yeah,
Um,
yes.
Actually, we have got a feedback that your sound has dropped. So, can you
Ye-
readjust your microphone so
Yes,
that,
yes, I will try.
yeah,
Yeah, okay. All
yes.
right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, the ecological damage that I have spoken about and the blocking of outfalls to the sea makes because of which there is regular flooding in Karachi. This year, because the rains were very high, Karachi was completely destroyed by the floods, except for its main arteries. Huge areas came underwater. Roads became rivers, low-lying areas became lakes. This is not dissimilar from what is happening in the rest of the world. But what needs to happen in Karachi, we have documented in considerable detail, and it is something that is on my web, which you might like to look at. These are some examples of land reclamation and problems with it. I won't go into the details, but you can see certain areas that jut out into this backwaters of one of the creeks, the informal settlements that have developed on the water. Again, the same thing. But another thing is changing. The whole locations of low income settlements, and that is the motorbike. In 1990, we had 450,000 motorbikes. In 2013, we had 1,350. Today, we have 300,000. We have much more motorbikes than we have cars. Now, because of this, and it's going to increase, and there's nothing to stop them. Because of this, people can now live a good 30 miles, 45 kilometers out of the city and make this journey. So, what has started happening is farmland in these villages from where people go to work is being converted by developers again into homes. And also, as a result of which, people from neighboring villages and settlements also go and buy homes or rent them out in these locations, which are near the main roads, where the roads are good, so that they can access their places of work. Motorbikes, I'll forget all this. And then, of course, is the biggest problem today, and that is traffic, congestion, difficulty in commuting. Four different cities in our region with four very different, not four different with the same problem. Now, I'm just coming to the end of this. Now, the civil society discussions that are taking place is that 4,000 hectares within the city have to be brought into the land market for low income housing. It's very difficult that to imagine how this demand will succeed. Second, make the market accessible to families earning 30,000 rupees. Again, for this, we need a much larger portfolio, loan portfolio, than we have at present. A social housing program, many programs have been devised, does not seem possible in the present circumstances. A comprehensive land reform, urban land reform, to discourage speculation, increase densities for elite and middle income settlements. Some understanding, I think, can be reached, but it's still a question mark. Modify bylaws and zoning regulations to make them pro street, pro pedestrians, and pro mixed land use. This is possible because a section of the elite would like this to happen, at least in their areas. And the architectural community is also quite fixated on it. Then there is the support of process of densification of informal settlements of Kachi Abadis, providing technical and managerial guidance. This is something that we are working on. I will very briefly explain what we are trying to do. As far as land reform is concerned, Land Ceiling Act has been discussed. You are, in India also you had it once upon a time. I don't know how useful it was or what has been the result of doing away with it. Minimum density for any urban development project, that also is again something that is part of this land reform. That there should be a large enough non-utilization fee on development on urban land so as to discourage speculative investment. Main opponents, of course, are the developers. No loan should be offered for housing for those who already received loans previously. Also difficult because the elite want loans. And then the development of land inventory and its yearly updating and publication. Nobody disagrees with that, but somehow it doesn't take place. And then technical and financial support to communities and the informal sector in housing for densification purposes. As far as the future is concerned, it is becoming necessary to understand what sort of city we will become, given the trends I have identified. This will require a very different form, this understanding. It will require a very different form of research from the traditional sort of research that is carried out for master planning processes. The focus will have to be on the needs of low income communities, and the majority, which form the majority of our population. And one of the needs, which is extremely important, is dignity. How do you inculcate dignity in the planning process, dignity for the low income groups in the planning process? How do you get rid of a very strong anti poor bias in government, in the private sector, anti poor bias also in the academia? So, that again is an issue. Then, in our strategic plan, our vision is that we are going to be a world class city. When this was formulated, some of us tried to put across the vision of a pedestrian and commuter friendly city. If that had been accepted, I think our development plans, projects would have been very different. But given COVID 19, health, education, the size of and location of their institutions, their training facilities, and, and decentralized systems of governance will have to become priorities. But something that is very important, which we don't really have, is the need for an urban research and training institute. This has been felt more acutely, especially after COVID 19 and the recent floods, felt more acutely than ever before. Civil service servants do go to sort of community projects, they do go to innovative projects, but it's a very different thing from being trained to manage, especially to manage uh, projects and to maintain them. These are two very weak things in a whole planning process. This is an intervention that we are working at. It's a place called Punjab Colony in Karachi. An informal settlement. The area that we are looking at is marked in red, and a part of the area for which we have developed plans is given in the detail of the plan. These are the plots on which houses are present. And we have developed alternatives for them for that one street. Now, there are about 186 plots of land where people would like to sell to developers. This is according to the developers. We haven't really looked at at the list that he has given us, but according to the developers, we have this number. And the developers say that they can easily negotiate this for one whole street, which they have identified, and build and sell off those properties. So there will be कितने बनते हैं एक सड़क पे? 100, 40 into 3, 120 apartments will be immediately available if we build this on ground plus 2 basis. Now, if you do this in other Kachi Abadis also, and the government passes the necessary rules and regulations for it, then through the informal sector, functioning exactly as it functions today, except with better planning and with availability of credit. We can deliver this without any major cost to cost to government, as except for the laying of infrastructure and the paving of roads and the creation of open spaces. This can be done incrementally over a period of time. Those people who do not wish to join in this, they need not join in this. Eventually, I am sure that they will. There is a need to limit the height of these buildings because sometimes they go up to 7, 8 floors, and very often because they are not supervised properly, because their structural design is weak, they too collapse. I think 2 or 3 buildings normally in a year built on this pattern do collapse in Karachi. Now, this was long ago. I took this pledge in 1983 after after uh, evaluating a major development project, urban rehabilitation project in Karachi. Well, I have kept my word. I think some sort of oath should be taken by architects and planners, just like doctors take an oath, the Hippocratic oath. Of course, you don't have to keep the oath, as many doctors don't, but I think it still has a very important impact on on the medical profession, and I'm sure that it will also have a similar impact on the architecture and planning professions. But the head of an architectural institution in Karachi said to me, he said, "अरे भाई ये कैसे कर सकते हैं हम तो बाजार में बैठे हैं. Arif, how can we do this? We are sitting in the market." So this will always remain an issue. Now, I always show this because I watched this change take place at this stretch of beach. This was a beach where you could sort of hire chairs. I think when we did this, it was 15 rupees for half an hour, and sit in the water and wet your feet. You could have your head massaged. You could stand in front of this Japanese garden, have your photograph taken and sent back to Afghanistan and say, "I'm in Japan." You could hire binoculars to see the sea, have your photograph taken, ride on a camel, shoot Indian and Pakistani film stars. All this was wiped out by this, made by the city government. All attempts to have that world that existed here, to have it integrated into this park, proved to be unsuccessful. I think this is the most important change that is required. This lack of understanding of local culture, recreation, understanding of building around it rather than pushing it out. Well, thank you so much for this. And if there are any questions, comments, I will be happy to deal with them.
Thank you so much, Arif Saab. That was wonderful. It was such a detailed sort of narrative that you took us through of Karachi, and I think I would also kind of say that this is a story not only of Karachi and Pakistan but all of South Asia. I mean, it kind of resonates, I think, with a lot of things that are happening across the region. And thank you for such a kind of broad canvas that you've sort of drawn out in telling us the story of cities. So really, thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm gonna just two questions I have, and then there are some questions in the question and answer box as well. So we'll go there. But I think one question that I had, and I think we everyone has been following very closely this your the Orangi project itself, and if you can also maybe I mean, you've shown us some of those images, but if you can talk a little bit about the processes, like what were the ways in which you were working on the ground, what were the ways in which who were the agencies that you were working with, what were some of the mechanics in which the Orangi project worked, and then now you're presenting also the Punjab Colony, right, and also sort of trying to kind of work out alternatives to starting to look at how some of that development can be organized in some ways. So if you can just take us through some of the mechanics on the ground of how things worked.
Well, can I switch off the screen now?
Sure,
Hmm?
sure, you can. Yes.
Yeah, इसे बंद कर दे. Yeah? मेरे से मत कहो बंद करने को, मुझे नहीं पता. कर मत.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. All right. Good. You see, Urangi was a Kachiyabadi. It still is, although it has been marked for regularization. So it is secure because of that. But it was a Kachiyabadi. And Akhtar Hamid Khan, very well known Pakistani social scientist, uh, he was asked by a very well known Pakistani bank to do some work in Urangi for the Bihari community who had settled there after the Bangladesh war. He said that he was not going to do anything of the sort, but if they wanted him to do something for Urangi, he would look at it. He spent 6 months roaming around, talking to people, discussing things with one or two of his colleagues, and he identified four major problems. No survey was carried out. These were just conversations, meetings. One was sanitation, number one priority. Number two priority was education. Number three priority was jobs. And number four priority was health. And so he began with sanitation. He firmly believed in taking one thing at a time. So he began with sanitation, and that is when he called me, which was, I think, a year after he began the project. And it was very important what he said to me. He said, "Look, if you can't make this cheap enough, then you please go home." And I said, "What do you mean by cheap enough?" He said, "You talk to them and see how much they are willing to pay. Not a penny am I not going to subsidize this with a single penny. And the major work can be done by the government, but the neighborhood has to be taken over by the people. It's theirs, and they must invest in it." So that is how I got involved. And I told him, "Look, I'm not a sanitation person." He said, I don't mind, even if you are a quack. If you can lower the price and it works, that's better for me, much better than all these fancy engineers who've come to see me. So it was a long thing, this experimentation, to see how costs could be lowered. And also, it was important to identify the constraints that there were. There was the psychological barrier. This is not our job, this is the government job. Why should we invest a penny in it? The second was the economic barrier. We don't have the money to do it. The third was the social barrier. We have to come together to work on the neighborhood, but we are not going to come together. We don't like so and so is a thief, etc. And lastly was the technical barrier that they did not know how to build an underground sewage system. And there was also pressure from international agencies and from NGOs, certain NGOs, that you should have soak pits because there was not enough water to make the sewage flow in the drains. And the people said that, sorry, we are not going to have soak pits. We want a system like the one that exists in other parts of Karachi. So these barriers had to be overcome. Psychological barrier was the most difficult to overcome. It involved taking them to visit the offices of the Karachi Development Authority, or taking them to visit the offices of the Karachi Municipal Corporation, where they were told that there are no plans for you because you can't afford them. And the rich people whom you keep talking about, they actually pay for all this through development charges. So then they understood, yes, there has to be, if we can do this, maybe our major problem will be overcome. It took 6 months for the first lane to be laid to agree. Also, there were no disposal points, so we disposed into the natural drainage system, for which I was heavily criticized. And I told them if the rest of Karachi can go into the natural drainage system, then so can Urangi go into the natural drainage system, because their sewage is not very dissimilar from that of the rest of Karachi. But that one lane developed into a neighborhood. And that one neighborhood developed into a large area of about, I think, 27,000 odd houses. So that is how it took off. So you had the problem there, and you had the solution before you. You had the cost that was affordable. In many cases, it was not affordable. So women saved money from their housekeeping money, put it together, and made the payments. The money was mostly collected and paid by women, not by the men, but the work was done by the men. So at every lane, a lane was about 20 to 40 houses. Every lane had an organization. The reason for having a lane as an organization was because it was small, everyone knew each other. So the problems of mistrust were sort of limited to some extent because of that. So this is how it began. Big meetings, small meetings to begin with at the neighborhood level, then larger meetings, then still larger meetings, and then no meetings at all because it's sort of spread by itself, with us supervising, making the plans and supervising the work. After some time, we stopped supervising the work. We identified those people who had built their switch systems, masons who had worked on it, and every time a request came, we gave the names of those people to the lane organization or the neighborhood organization.
Yeah,
So this is
yeah.
how it began, and then of course it went into other things, housing and health.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually, it seems like the Orangi project was a very, I mean, it's an important case study, for South Asia in many ways. And I'm also I mean, you spoke about the Punjab colony. So what is the status now of the Orangi project? And, are there any kind of ways in which, learnings from there are in some ways being sort of taken forward in the current Kutchi Abadis, and how do you see the difference now with what you're doing?
You see, Urangi was an answer to a particular uh, point in time. Now, all that has been developed in Urangi is being followed by settlements who are at that stage of development, mainly in the Punjab, because that's where the Chiabadis of that sort uh, exist and are likely to continue for some time. And in Sindh also, in the rest of Sindh, in the rural areas. So that is the role Urangi has taken upon itself. Its previous director, Parveen Rahman, felt very strongly about these areas. Now, as far as understanding the new developments which I've pointed out to, how things are changing, Punjab Colony is the ideal place. Just 1 minute. So what is happening there is really an understanding right now. That's what we are trying to develop. And I think we have understood a few things. But what is important to understand there are the developers themselves. Where do they get this money? Why are they so successful? Why do people agree to sell their properties? What happens to these settlements after people start living there? One thing is definite, the people don't like it, but it gives them an income. It saves them from living on the fringe of the city. And the stumbling block here is that these buildings are illegal. If we can have a plan where through which this sort of development takes place, maybe we can have part of this legalized, maybe a 21-year lease, maybe a 50-year lease, whatever. But that depends on negotiations. As far as the developers are concerned, they don't want to have anything to do with this. They build and go, hand over and go. And they say that as soon as they are sold, the people should form a union and take it over. They don't want to touch it after it's complete, which I understand perfectly.
I just have one other question and then we'll move on to the question and answer session. What was really, really striking in some of the statistics that you showed was the participation of women in the education sector. You know, I mean, that was is really sort of amazing to see the figure. Like architecture was 92%.
Yes, at that time.
Right? Like and in some ways, you know, what are, and it's I think what is also interesting is to then think of, you know, the home, the idea of the home beyond the house itself, you know, like starting to think of the idea of the neighborhood as home, the city as home, and what you showed in terms of that the beach development was really kind of talking about taking away the homeness of the city.
Yes.
And so I think that is something that is really, really important. Like it may be, and we've had so many instances in Mumbai. We have cases where, you know, like older houses, like the Chawls, for example, the
Yeah.
density of houses were very, very, very high. But in some ways, the city took over, the neighborhood took over, the common spaces took over. So the house was really not this small entity, you know, the house was a porous entity, but the kind of outside spaces took over. So it's really kind of changed the definition of the idea of the home, you know. And when you showed these kind of figures, it just struck me that perhaps one really kind of starts need to rethink this idea of the home, you know, which has become the propertied entity of how much you're building. And then you sort of also maybe calculate densities differently because there's all of this, you know, the spill out spaces and other things to think about. So I think, I mean, I think this very, like what the kind of the last bits that you presented were very interesting because in some ways it also expands this idea of starting to think of, you know, public transport, the idea of the city as an expanded idea of the home. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think this is something that is not only for Karachi and for Pakistan, but all of South Asia in some ways to change some of the epistemes through which, you know, we're looking at the ideas of development. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And you, I mean, also what is interesting that you laid out the politics of, you know, of this land and how, you know, how things are working out. But also in some ways, I think what will be interesting is to kind of really work with, and you said that, you know, like the mechanics of how developers work, how, you know, processes on the ground work, and is it possible to, you know, slowly sort of tweak it from the mechanics of how things work on the ground. So I know that there's a huge challenge, and you've placed the whole sort of scenario. You've showed us how, you know, publics are becoming more conservative, and this is across South Asia. You know, the way the voter politics is working today, it's something that how neoliberal policies are working. It's something that is, I think, common across South Asia. But where are some of the cracks? Where could some of the possibilities of interventions work at the level of the mechanics of working out on the ground will be something that will be important for us to work through.
It's a new world, it's a new actors. I often say that the old informal developers, whom we have always called the Lal, they were okay. They were crooked, they were gangsters, but it was easy to establish a conversation with them. The new developers who are sort of determining how the city functions and what develops and what doesn't develop, they are a different lot. They are so closely engaged with those in power and with money that the dialogue has to be a very different dialogue. We still have to learn how to talk to them, the mechanics of it.
Yeah. I'm going to move to the question and answer session box here because there are quite a few questions. So the first question is from Mario Adam, who says, why are plot amalgamation and high-rise apartments with lifts not proposed as an alternative option for the region?
There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, is our prejudice against high rise buildings. Number two, these have been built by the state, not by the informal developers. The maintenance of the lifts, the maintenance of the plumbing systems, of the electrical systems, all this, because of the failure in doing this, these buildings very quickly become slums. They become worse slums than the old Kachhi Abadis, which are actually called slums. That's, I think, one reason. The other reason is if they are properly located, then the developers have them vacated. Even if the people have the right of possession, they sell that possession. They don't sell the plot, the property, but they sell the possession and they get converted into middle income housing. So I think these are the two reasons uh, mainly why these high rise buildings with lifts are not made. And of course, the third reason is the developer who comes to informal developer doesn't have the money to invest in this. He can only invest in something that is as cheap as possible. What we are attempting to do is to make it possible for him to invest more and produce better housing. But a lift and all that goes with it would be would not be affordable to him or to the people who come to buy it.
There's an anonymous attendee who says, have there been any redevelopment schemes introduced by the government for the inhabitants here? What was the impact of those schemes, and were they received well and adapted to? Any redevelopment schemes?
There have been a number of schemes. Most of the schemes, the earliest schemes are perhaps the most successful. Those were done in the 70s and 80s. After that, I don't think there has been any quote unquote social housing as such. It's been given over to the developers to build and to sell. And they have not been on a large enough scale to make a difference. Uh, Now we hear that there is not here we know that there are big plans for housing for low income groups in which the state is going to invest. But here again, it's the developers who are going to build it. Uh, so it is unlikely that they will be affordable to the poor. Maybe to the lower middle income, yes, I think they might be affordable if the loans are available to them, but certainly not to the low income groups. We've had redevelopment schemes. Uh, they didn't go too well, unfortunately. badly, badly implemented, badly designed, both things.
There is another question asking, are there any rental housing among the informal settlements, or are they all individually owned?
No, there are rental housing also. Much of the densification housing that I showed you, the Kachiabadi is going up 7, 8 floors, much of it is rental housing. But as I said, it's very vulnerable because there are no rental laws. And in these settlements, whoever is strong enough gets his way. So most of these landlords, those who have built this housing or taken it over subsequently for rental purposes so that they can give it out on rent, are powerful people in the neighborhood. So if you don't pay your rent for 3 months, you are out. There are no questions asked. They put your things out and tell you, all right, go.
So this one is a comment by Moksha Jain. She says, "Hello, sir. I have been an ardent follower of your work, especially have been following works of OPP and Parveen Rahman. Your work with Orangi has been inspirational. Thank you so much for such a great session."
Well,
So
thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
there's another comment also from my colleague Prasad Shetty. He says, just a comment, your pledge is a tremendous inspiration as well as direction to define the ethical frameworks for architects, which is otherwise largely articulated through professional logistics. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
The next one is both a comment and a question. Thank you very much for the presentation. It has triggered many questions in the mind. You mentioned the need for change in the traditional master planning process. While on one side we have the interventions via state, and on the other, the informal developers you introduced us to. Very curious to know what cities, what roles you see would help in the real world to directly intervene in such places. What hat to wear? Urban designer of a private consultancy firm, master planner with the city council, financial consultancy ready to invest in such transformations. So what hat to wear to kind of work with these things that you've been discussing?
I wish I knew. I don't really know. All I know is that I have still to understand this rapidly changing world that is emerging. All the time, there are new players that are coming into this. The nature of municipal governments is changing. Academia is still lost as to where it should really be working on what, or on an understanding of what the overall situation is. So there are different people looking at the same situation from very different angles, which has happened in the past also. But when it did happen in the past, let's say 40 years ago, you had something that was known as the UN, and a very powerful one. So it brought many of these things together. Today, it really has almost no role to play. It neither controls policies, nor directs policies, nor advises on policies. So I think it'll take a little bit of time before these things fall in place. It won't happen in my lifetime, but it'll happen in your lifetime. For me, it will be like going away in the middle of a film. But I think you will see it happen in the next 10, 15 years.
So there's Rizwan Atik saying, "Sir, can you please shed light on the mechanism of Sadr in Karachi? How can it revive back to its full potential like it once used to be for Karachi? Also, in a pro-pedestrian scenario, what would be the solution of all the traffic that has turned Sadr into a transit patch only, and would a dignified structure for all the hawkers?" There would be a project for that, falls under the 4 points you mentioned in your presentation. So yeah, I think talking about the southern area in Karachi.
Well, thanks to the Supreme Court of Pakistan, they have got rid of the hawkers. I am of the view that they will all come back. I do not think Supreme Court judgment or no Supreme Court judgment, I do not think that they can be kept out, especially after COVID. I think we will have to, as a result of COVID, if we do not start rethinking Sadar and its adjacent areas planning, where you had over 10,000 hawkers who have just been pushed out, I don't think that you can restore many of the very important businesses and trades that have been uprooted. Dry fruit trade was in literally in crores of rupees a month. It came from Afghanistan. Tea even larger. It came from Sri Lanka and Kenya. Even the trade of birds and wildlife came from Singapore and Latin America. And these are not these are not fabulously sophisticated people who did it. They were just good merchants, good businessmen, and they employed all these people both in wholesale, retail, supply, etc. So I personally think that we are going to succeed in getting it back. Maybe in a better planned way, but there will be an element of gentrification in it because your elite wants Sadar, your municipal council wants Sadar to be, as they say, a world-class area. So we will have that problem, but I think the hawkers will come back. They've already said that they will come back wearing good clothes. They've also said they are willing to wear a uniform. Now, so we've come down to that level of ludicrousness. So I think it will happen. As far as traffic is concerned, we have the traffic plans. They've been discussed, argued upon, agreed, disagreed. It's been going on for many years. If some basic decisions are taken, I think we can easily solve the traffic problems of Sadar at least, if not of all of Karachi.
So that's, I think there's one question. If I didn't read it wrong, they're saying one statistic said that vegetables and food production went up dramatically in the city. How is the urban and rural reconciled in thinking of the city?
Unfortunately, as far as Karachi's rural areas are concerned, the Karachi division's rural areas are concerned, their interests have never been taken into consideration by any of the plans. All the plans have said that these are Karachi's lungs and they should be maintained as such. Well, we've sort of managed to get rid of much of those lungs because the whole development process was about extracting maximum value out of land, whatever land it was, wherever you could lay your hands on. So agricultural production has gone down tremendously. Large areas which were uh, agricultural areas, which were gardens, fruit gardens, are now housing, both high income housing as well as kachi abadis and anything in between. So Karachi has grown, expanded on its agricultural lands. And when you talk to the planners, they say, where else could we have gone? Do you have an option? Which in a way is true, but it could have been better managed. And much of Karachi's green areas, much of it could have been salvaged.
I think this is the last question, also referring to the beach. I think you've answered most of it, but I'll still read it. So, with reference to the example of the beach, which you gave, which talked about the initial informal and organic interaction that took place between the hawkers and visitors, and later the development of a park, which took away the earlier functions, do you think that with changing times and desires, this new development and all other such similar developments could have a potential to bring back the informal, homely feel with a new character for users?
I doubt it. I doubt whether this will happen in the near future. No, I don't think so. It can happen in much, but much later when you have a more active population, more aware population, more involved population, especially of architects and planners, and especially of academia. I think it can. Academia has a very big role to play, which it does not play, unfortunately, today, but it can play it. And I see that it is becoming more and more involved in these issues, which is a very good sign.
I think that was the last question, so we'll end there. But I just want to also, I mean, I think it was interesting the way you said that in when you're talking about the hawkers sort of, being taken away from the place, but the fact that they will come back, and I mean, in some ways, yes, we are pessimistic about cities, but what we've seen across, across South Asia is that cities in some ways are also beyond the plan and policy. Cities are also about life and living, and sometimes there are tactical processes in which they operate, and life takes over, and it's like a multi-headed hydra that at some point you cut a tentacle and it sort of, another
Sometimes,
one goes back. And I think that's I think somewhere the hope that cities also sort of give us. So at the same time, where it's important for us as also, citizens, as practitioners, to keep nudging the development towards, sort of working with the ethics and the idea of social justice, the idea of spatial justice. I think the cities will also in some ways find their own ways of sort of bouncing back, and I think that's the hope. And for us, it's, I think, important to keep working at this process of nudging this development to sustain its life. So I think
well,
that's,
cities are living things. They're
yeah,
not dead things. What you don't give to a city, it acquires it by itself.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's the hope that cities give us. So thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Yeah,
It was a pleasure seeing you again and pleasure talking to you
yes.
and to the.
We hope to stay in touch with you and interact with you for many more sessions. And I would just also like to thank all the participants for joining, also my colleagues who have helped set this up, Dipti, Anuj, Dushyant, who have been in the process of setting up the symposium here, also my co-trustees. And I would also like to thank the Urban Design Research Institute, which partly funds this session, and they've been partners with us since the inception of the school. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Arif Saab.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye bye.